The fourth is diction. What is the expression or the meaning? How are the words of the play written? You know, when you are listening to a play, or even if you're watching a movie, because this is applicable to that, you can tell by the language of the people what region of the country they come from, if they come from a different country. In this character, in this type of play, this category, Aristotle discusses the stylistic elements of the play. He's interested in how words are used, and he said that it is a mark of genius, for to make good metaphors implies an eye for resemblance. So let's look at diction as the expression of the meaning of the words. The fifth is music. I've also seen this written as melody or song, but music is the most common one, and it is usually the musical element of the chorus, but for our application, it is all the aural, A-U-R-A-L, elements of the play, other than the words, other than the sounds of the actors. The rhythms, the tones, the textures, the door opening, the car door closing, the car driving off, all of the sound effects that underscore the play. That is what music is. The final part of Aristotle's tragedy of theory is spectacle. He says it's the least connected with literature. He said the production of spectacle effects depends more on the art of the stage machinist than on the poet. And although he recognizes the emotional attraction of spectacle, he says that superior poets will rely on the inner structure of the play rather than the spectacles to arouse the pity and fear within its audience. Okay, now you should be aware of all of these following 6 concepts of Aristotle 6: plot, character, thought, diction, music, and spectacle. He said that plot should not be episodic, and he said the connection is best when it is the believable but unexpected. He thinks complex plots are better than simple plots. They should have recognitions and reversals. And he gives you Oedipus the King. Really, if you just read a synopsis of that, is really epitomizes what Aristotle feels about plot. He also says that catharsis of pity and fear was a part of going to see the theater, that's where your catharsis should come, and then it wouldn't bleed over into your life. It purifies the audience when it purges us of our fear and our pity, and so that we can overcome our emotions. And that's what theater is supposed to do for you, particularly tragedy. I did want to speak a little bit about the costumes of the Greeks, and while performers were in a lot of gaudy attire, the Dionysian festival was very different. The comic actors wore kothornos, which was a boot with these soles. If you look at the bottom of the screen of this picture, it was very, very thick. But we also found that serious tragic actors wore kothornos because it made them higher in stature. And if you were in the back of the theater, then we wanted you to appear larger than life. And then the mask that they used extended far above their head, and there was really only one outlet for the voice. Now, the ancient Greek theater was composed of 3 major parts: the orchestra, the skene, and the main seating area. The theatron, which is the main seating area, is called the seeing place. And the orchestra was called the dancing circle, very different from what we call an orchestra today. And the paradoi on stage left or stage right of the skene were entry points for people to come in. Now, early on in this time, there used to be an altar, because remember, this used to be ritualistic sacrifice to Dionysus the god. As they moved away from that ritual, that platform became a place for the lead chorus person to stand, and that meant that they were the leader. The circle was supposed to have this supernatural power, and so the orchestra, being the dancing circle or the acting space, would give everything in it a magical aura. And they didn't keep everything in the dancing circle, But they used to have a tent in the back for actors to go and change in. And then they built this skene. So if you look at the skene, Skene, they would come out from those columns after a scene change. And if you look in front of the skene, you'll see that there was a little elevated platform called the prosceno, which was situated in front of the skene, and it was called the pro and the scene. And they also decorated the background. If you look at the top of the skene, you see this little stick that would rotate in front, and they would use this to show gods coming in to give their message over the dancing circle or the orchestra. So the other thing of the two entrances of the paradoid, the one on the right and the one on the left, from which the chorus and the actors came, if someone was entering from the right, that means they were coming from the city or the port. And so you just knew that as a part of the culture. If they were coming from the left, they were coming from the fields or from abroad. And so lots of things you had to understand about the theater, but what I really wanted you to understand is the three areas of the theatron, the orchestra, and the skene, and then the paradoi as the entry points of actors and chorus coming in. If you were seated in the front part of the theatron, it was called the proeditria, and that's where officials and priests sat. And if you sat in the back part, then that was just for your regular people who were not considered a part of the high Greek society. This is just a small look at the ruins of a skene and how the actors would enter back and forth, and if you were acting as gods, how you could be on top of the skene. And it's just a close-up of one of our ruins. In this last part of the PowerPoint lecture, we're going to look at the Roman theatrical context. In addition, we're going to look at how Rome's experience might have differed from the Greek experience. And lastly, we're going to talk about two of their main playwrights, which was Terence and Plautus. And maybe at the end we'll wrap it up with a look at the other Roman dramas that were happening at the time of the Roman Empire. Now we're going to move on to the Romans. The Romans loved entertainment of all kinds. Roman comedy was wild, unrestrained, lewd, and highly realistic. And when you think of the accounts and you read about the events of Roman theater, there was very little left to the imagination. And actors wore the mask like the Greeks did and padded costumes, but they were a little bit more gaudier, of course, than the Greeks. During the 2nd and 3rd centuries, they borrowed a lot from the Hellenistic comedies, which belonged to the Greeks. And the Romans were very receptive to the playwrights of Greek comedy. They didn't much like tragedy. The beginnings of Roman theater started with the Roman festivals called the Ludi festivals, and then after Julius Caesar took over, they went from about 75 festivals to 175 festivals, and 101 were devoted to theater. The first stone theater was built in Rome by Julius Caesar, and if you look at this picture, you'll see how the theater has changed much from the Greeks building a theater. Plus, they had the invention of cement that really gave them the ability to build a theater anywhere they wanted to build the theater. Now, while the Romans borrowed Greek ideas and improved on them, that's kind of a question, they were less philosophical. And their theater encompassed more than just drama. They had gladiators, acrobats, jugglers, chariot races, boxing, animal fights, and the entertainment tended to be grandiose and diversional. And the reason why they used it as a diversion was because of the bread and circus. You know, as Rome grew, they didn't have a way to control the masses, so what they would do is have entertainment and a little food. And so people came primarily as Rome started to really grow too big and couldn't take care of their infrastructure. They would use entertainment to placate the masses. Actors and performers were called histriones, and these were the people that Rome hired and really kept things going. But also, the interesting thing in bringing this all together, in their entertainment, they had the killing of Christians, sacrifice of Christians and slaves and people who worked against the state. It was nothing to see that happen as a halftime activity, like, say, a football game would have a band, or maybe flags or performances. Theirs would be the killing of Christians and people who worked against the Roman state. Now, there were three major influences on Roman theater: Greek drama, Etruscan influences that had the circus-like elements, and Fabula Italiana. And these were near Naples, and these were short, improvised farces. And from this part, we're going to see Commedia dell'arte come out of this going into the Renaissance period. They had stock characters. And of those stock characters, they had the braggart, they had the foolish old man, they had the drunkard or the swindler or the hunchback. And also during this time, if you were a woman performer, you were a woman of ill repute. They had a few women, but it was only in those acts where there had to be sexual acts, and then women were included in that. So you had Circus Maximus, which had some of the buildings that they built had tracks that could race 12 chariots at a time. They had prize fightings, gladiator races. It was really more three-dimensional, and they had machinery lifts for animals. They really got into the spectacle. So I think this is where we see Aristotle's sixth change, where spectacle became really more important than the plot. Roman theater was under the empire, and so with the several festivals that they had, I mentioned the bread and circuses, where the masses could attend the circuses. These were usually paid for by the state or a wealthy citizen so that free admission could be had for all. And the events were very lengthy because they did have plays, but they probably did have ship battles in some of the stadiums that they built. Oh, by the way, and we'll talk a bit about this a little bit in architecture, our football stadiums are based on the Roman stadiums, if you look at how our football stadiums are built. And I found this funny cartoon. I thought it was very interesting, and it speaks to the sequels that we have to have in all of our movies. X-Men has 3 sequels. Harry Potter's got one more sequel. Rocky, several sequels to those. And so that's the reason why it was making fun of us, this cartoon, Arena 1 through 5, about how there's not much variety in the movies. There were 2 major playwrights that I wanted to speak to. One was Plautus, and he was the one that provided a picture of a playwright who was really principally a translator and an adapter. What he did is he copied Greek originals and he changed the locations to Rome, and then he inserted details of Roman life. His characters, I'll remind you, were not individuals, but they were types, like the braggart soldier and the miser, and or the mistreated slave who was smarter than everyone, by the way. It's kind of what we follow when we have the maid who's smarter than anyone, or the child who's smarter than anyone in the family. And it had to have slapstick and sight gags. This all had to do with spectacle, and it had to be farcical, and it had to appeal directly to the emotions. They were not particularly well written. Plautus' plays were not, but they worked well enough on stage, and he was the favorite at the time. Now, Terence was better educated than Plautus, and he was more of a literary writer, and he had 6 plays, and he drew on universal situations. He was not really popular at the time because he didn't use a lot of buffoonery or banality, but in his own time, I would say after he died, he did become one of the the most favorite playwrights because his works tended to last through time, and they were not a copy of the Greek works. They were works of looking at the overall universality of the world. In this final slide, I'd like to give you a little bit more background on Roman theater. Admissions to the Roman theater was free, and seats were not reserved, and the audiences, they were often unruly. But in his prologue, Plautus always lists several types of behaviors that were common among Roman audiences. And I'll just give you a few of those. Let no worn-out prostitute sit in the front part of the auditorium, nor the guards make any noise with their weapons, nor the ushers move about in front of spectators or show anyone to seats while the actors are on stage. Don't let seats be taken up by slaves for free men, and let nursemaids keep little children at home. Isn't that interesting that all of that is the same thing that we want right now? The plays also had to compete with other attractions, and consequently the audiences always had to provide this entertainment that would satisfy a mass audience. Now, most Roman comedies did not deal with political or social issues, but usually everyday domestic issues, and almost always the plots were turned on misunderstanding or mistaken identity, long-lost children. And so it's really the same things that we see right now. There were very few respectable women who appeared in Roman plays, and although love affairs were the source of the play's intrigues, the women were seldom involved in that on stage. And while we are looking at Roman plays, one of the things that I would like to tell you is that in Plautus's plays, about 2/3 of the lines were accompanied by the flute. And the flute player remained on stage throughout the play, and the actors just ignored this flute player's presence. And there were a number of songs by the characters rather than the chorus as we see in Greek. And in a performance, a Roman comedy closely resembled our modern musical. Things started to change a little bit, and we see the Roman preference for a variety of entertainment, and short plays drove regular comedy and tragedy off the stage. The late form of theater in Rome was mime, and this was typically a short, usually a comic, topical, improvisatory playlet. It was not silent like we are accustomed for mime today. And women played the female roles in the mime because mime was apparently being the first form in which female players were permitted to perform. The mime actors did not wear any mask, and it was usually more realistic conventions than tragedy or comedy. Now, the masks that you are looking at right now are a variety of the mask versus the comedy tragic mask that you see in Greeks. Roman actors were referred to as histriones and mimes, and later histriones was the most prevalent and most primary used name for actors. And I'll remind you before that the actors were primarily male, and if you were a female in the play, usually you were not a well-respected woman. As we move down into the historical marker about 6th century, Theodora was an actress, and she married Emperor Justinian of the Eastern Empire. So she had to renounce her profession of acting. And so what you'll see here is that we moved away from the Greek and Roman costume. There was a lot more music. And in addition to the mimes, the Roman festivals increased during this time, and we see an emphasis on bloody sports along with mimes and a variety of entertainment. And we also, as Christianity grew, we also saw that the mimes ridiculed all the sacraments and beliefs that the Christians held. And eventually that's why we see the music and theater disappear as we go into the Middle Ages because of all the ridicule. So this is our last slide. I hope that you glean some information from this PowerPoint lecture, and I will probably see you on the other side. Please take care.